Shutter speed is a camera setting that affects how exposed the image is and how much motion blur the image has. Think of your shutter as a gate that opens and closes and lets light in different time lengths. So light might be hitting the sensor for a second or half a second or 2 seconds or a quarter of a second. It's all depending on the shutter speed. And the longer the shutter is open, the more motion blur you're going to get. So you typically want to shoot with faster shutter speeds. That's going to help freeze the motion. Now, slower shutter speeds do increase exposure, but since they increase motion blur as well, that's why I usually recommend higher shutter speeds, because you want to freeze that action. Most amateur photography or just non-professional photography happens to have a lot of motion blur because it's typically a setting on the camera that people turn to auto, and the camera doesn't do a very good job of freezing motion all the time. Cameras like to prioritize exposure, and in doing so, they sometimes use slower shutter speeds than you would want. That's why I always use shutter speed in manual mode. I set it to 1 over 200, 1 over 160, or even in some cases 1 over 4,000 or 1 over 8,000. It just depends on how fast the subject is moving. The faster the subject you're trying to capture, the faster the shutter speed needs to be to make sure that motion is frozen. Because if you have that motion blur, it's going to make your images look not so perfect usually, and it's something that's very difficult, if not impossible, to fix in post-production. Some people say that those faster shutter speeds cause too much wear on the mechanical shutter. There's other people who argue that they say it's not that big of a deal. However, it is something to keep in mind when you're shooting that you probably don't want to use the fastest shutter speeds all the time. It's good every once in a while if you have a subject that's moving really, really fast. But in general, you want to use something a little bit more conservative, a little bit slower, not too slow because we don't want motion blur. But we don't want to shoot at that fast end either, because we want to make sure that we're getting enough light, we're letting that gate open long enough to let enough light in so that we don't have to use really fast aperture settings or really high ISO values. You may have noticed some photography or time-lapse footage that has light trails or really long streaks of motion blur. And that's an effect of using a really slow shutter speed, which I actually happen to like for time lapses and certain kinds of photography. Things that are moving fast have more blur. You see it with your eyes. If something's moving fast, it will have more motion blur. And so you can use a slow shutter speed to recreate that same effect, especially for a time lapse where you're speeding things up in post-production. I'd really stay away from using auto mode for shutter speed. Motion blur is one of those things that you don't want to have to deal with in post-production, and if you want a really crisp, clear image, you're going to need a faster shutter speed than what your camera is probably going to default to. So I'd say always shoot with a manual shutter speed so you can pick how much blur you want in your image. But shutter speed is just one aspect that affects the exposure of an image. We also have ISO and aperture to worry about.